Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 11. Today we're diving deep into the topic of food plots, and joining us is the 2004 QDMA Deer Manager of the Year, a wildlife habitat consultant, and author of the new book, Food Plot Success by Design. This is Jeff Sturgis. So kick back, get ready to take some notes, and enjoy. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. Here with me, as always, is my partner in crime, Dan Johnson. And with us today also is a very special guest, Mr. Jeff Sturgis. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be on the show.
Yeah, we're excited about it as well. And, Jeff, as I mentioned in the show introduction, you were the Quality Deer Management Association's 2004 Deer Manager of the Year. You run a very successful wildlife habitat consulting business, and you've also authored two books, Whitetail Success by Design and Food Plot Success by Design. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into whitetail hunting and habitat management, and then, how it all became a profession for you?
Sure, I sure can. I think, we'll try to make a long story very short, but, going back into when I first became interested in hunting, I grew up in a fishing family. No one in my family hunted at all. But through fishing, through magazines like Outdoor Life and Field and Stream, I was exposed to hunting, and I think I was 16, my brother was 14. We asked for bows to start hunting, and it really led into an extreme passion for whitetail hunting. And I did small game hunt in the beginning years, and I still do a little bit. But boy, everything whitetail was, a quick love of mine. And that led into, in my 20s, purchasing our first land that we could hunt on, hunting in the thumb area of Michigan. Through that and purchasing that land, I found that in the 90s there just really wasn't much information out there on food plotting and even habitat improvement. So I really had to scour and look to find, quality information on how to plant food plots, how to improve your habitat. Through there, I was led to and pointing towards a fellow by the name of Ed Spinazzola, which many people know. Oh, yeah. I consider him to be the father of modern food plotting. Just a great guy, wealth of information. And so I was pretty lucky to find someone like that. I think that would have been back in 1997. Through Ed, I really got exposed to the Quality Deer Management Association. Through there, just continued to make improvements on my own habitat. And I think it helped almost that I didn't have anyone guiding me along the way. I didn't have a dad or an uncle saying, sit in this blind, do this, do that. I really had to search for that information on my own. Through that, I found that there was a need out there to find information, and a lot of people just didn't have that information readily available to them. Right. So I looked to write about it, and I think I wrote my first article for Quality Whitetails in the end of 2003, first part of 2004, and that was on my property efforts in the UP of Michigan. And from there, it just kind of snowballed. It was recognized in 2004 with the Al Brothers Deer Manager of the Year Award. And then from there, I started getting calls from around the country, took this junk soil and turned it into something. And had people calling me, asking me how I would improve their land in Mississippi or Pennsylvania or lower Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, wherever it might be. And I thought, I could maybe start a business with this. So in 2005, started Whitetail Habitat Solutions and traveling around the country to help people and assist people on their own land. And I continued to write about it. Through the internet and hunting sites, blog sites, it became readily available that you really could write for these blogs and throw a lot of information out there. And I enjoyed sharing that information and participating in the discussions out there on the same subjects. Through that, I just thought, after I published a few articles with Quality Whitetails, Michigan Outdoors, I thought I had enough information that I could start writing some books, and that was actually several years before I ventured into writing books. But in 2012, I was finally able to put the first one together. In 2014, and just May of this year, I put the second one together, and here we are. I think what's really helped again is going back, just having that passion to do it and that drive, which a lot of people do, but really having that thirst to find information and really learn on my own, and seeking as much information out there as I could. I can think of, I think you had Craig and Neil Doherty on last week or the week before, and Neil Doherty and his book Grow 'em Right was a great book. One of the first ones really that provided a wealth of information on the subject. So trying to find information like that, put it together, experience my own observations and field experience with all my clients around the country. And I really feel like I've been blessed and fortunate enough to live in the whitetail woods most of the year and be able to write about it in return.
That's awesome. Well, I know that I'm certainly glad that you've been able to share those different lessons learned, because I've been able to take a lot from what you've shared online in your books, and it's helped me a lot too. But before we dive too much further into the real meat and potatoes of what I wanted to chat about here today, Dan, did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on related to Jeff, his history or personal life or anything like that?
Well, okay, so Jeff, I guess we're starting a new little thing on every podcast, and the way Mark has it in the notes here, it says Dan's crazy question.
Great.
So I just found out about this like 2 minutes before you were on the call. So
I like to keep everyone on their toes.
Right. I had to come up with one real quick. And so I guess my crazy question of the day to you is, let's say you just get done with a hard day at work, or you've been out in the timber, hunting pretty hard. You're going to go to your fridge and you're going to pull out a cold beverage or put a beverage on ice. What are you drinking?
Oh boy, that is putting me on the spot, isn't it? Was I walking a lot during the day? Am I ready to relax?
Yeah, you're ready to relax.
Yeah, if I'm ready to relax, there's a few choice beers that I don't mind sitting down to and having a couple of, and I think something like along the lines of an IPA. We have something over here called a Downtown Brown. One of those you can just kind of take a slow sip to, and something cold. I do actually like Diet Pepsi, something like that, Diet Cola. So, but really, if I was just going to relax, it'd probably be along the lines of one of those IPAs.
Okay. Now we know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, I guess so.
Now, Dan, I'm going to throw it back at you too, because we've talked occasionally about our cold beverages here on the show. We're all of age, of course, but I don't know if we've ever gotten to the specifics. So, Dan, what are you tipping back after a long, hard day in the office?
Well, for most of the time, I'm going to have to probably say 95% of the time, it's going to be Jack Daniels on ice, and that's about it. But that's if I'm not going anywhere. If I still have some things to do, like maybe mow the yard or something like that, I'll probably crack a line and Kugels of some sort.
Okay, solid choice. I'm a domestic light and cold guy, so it's usually a cheap light beer, whatever's handy at the time is what I'll probably crack after a hot day outside. But
hey, you'd probably like our Milwaukee's Best over here.
Yeah. Yep, had a little experience with that back in the day.
Yeah.
All right, so now
back to whitetails.
Yes, back to whitetails.
Yeah, exactly.
What we really wanted to talk about today, other than beer, is your new book. It's really revolving around food plots, and that book was called Food Plot Success by Design. And I've read it, and I believe it's really one of the most unique and interesting habitat-related books I've ever really read. But for the listeners out there, Jeff, could you tell us a little bit more about what this by design concept means and how you apply it to food plots in this book?
Yes, and that's, to me, every improvement that you make in the woods for whitetail should relate to each other. And what I mean by that is whether you're creating a great bedding area back in the knoll, food plot in a nice clearing, even travel corridors, native grass plantings, I really feel like that each one has a place on your property and nothing should be random. And that extends to your food plots too, in that food plot should fit within that entire movement of deer on your property. I believe that you can use food plots to not only attract deer, hold them, and protect them during the season. I also think that you can use food plots to determine where they travel on your property, how they relate to your own bedding areas on your property, and ultimately how that places them in front of your stand locations. So when I wrote that book, I wanted to discuss not just how to plant a food plot. There's some great books out there, including QDMA's Quality Whitetails, Ed Spinozola's food plot books. Just some great how-tos on planting food plots. But what I thought there was lacking was just a lot of information out there on not only, again, how you can attract these deer to your property, but with that level of attraction, what do you do with it? I think at some point you can attract so many deer to your property, and then if you go out there and you hunt haphazardly or aggressively on your property, you can create a situation where you actually repel more deer than you attract, meaning you develop this attract-repel condition. The deer come in, they're attracted to a quality food source, and then you repel them off, and you're almost better off not planting the food plot if that's the case. At the same time, you can use that food as a direction of travel. For example, you could have long, narrow food strips that are pointing off of your property, and I've seen people, almost accidentally do that to where they're setting up their neighbor 30 feet off the property line. And so at the same time, you can twist those around and complement them with bedding areas and keep those deer on your property. And there's some other things, too, we'll probably talk about later, but I know even food plots as it relates to where you position does and bucks and the type of bedding that you have on your property and where you can determine where deer are actually holding during the daylight hours.
Yeah, I just love this whole concept of using these food plots strategically to influence deer movement and then to help you as a hunter. Like you said, most other books and most other information out there that I've seen has always been focused on the what to plant, how much fertilizer to put out, what time of year to plant, etc. And that's important information. But like you said, there seemed to be a lack of resources about how to more strategically use these food plots as part of a greater system. And that's really what I've taken from your books, and it's helped me a ton. But maybe taking a step back to the basics a little bit, for someone who's new to food plotting, maybe one of our listeners who's always wanted to try it but been intimidated or for whatever reason felt they had limitations that kept them from being able to plant food plots. What questions should someone like that be answering or looking into right now before getting started with a food plot? Because at least from what I understand, what I've seen, you certainly don't want to just go buy a bag of seed and toss it in an open area. There's a lot more to it. So what should someone new to food plotting be thinking about before getting started?
Well, that puts a lot of thought spinning in my head, Mark. But I think, one of the things that just right off the bat, just something very basic, and I'm looking at actually some new food plots here around my home area here in Wisconsin now. And one of the first things we're looking at is, can we get seed on the ground? Are we going to be able to get the seed on the soil? They have a lot of great throw and grow mixes where you can just take some seed and toss it out in the field and hope to grow something. But one, if that seed's not hitting the soil, you're not going to be able to grow anything. And two, if you're competing with weeds and vegetation, you're not going to grow anything either.
Right.
And so just getting that seed on the soil is the first step, and that includes, is this area have enough elevation? Is it going to be wet during the fall? Are you going to have any problem with a type of non-solid soil to where you have moss or spongy tundra-type swamp location? Is it too rocky? Is it full of shale? So are you going to be able to even have a good soil base to work with? And then going from there, really, what are the conditions of the soil? And so that would include your pH level and where your fertility needs are going to be. And what I found is, all that can sound a little bit overwhelming to someone, and it's not that it's not some work, but at the same time, I've seen some incredible food plots planted in areas. And again, you have to, one of the things you really have to get almost full sun, 7 to 8 hours a day. But that aside, I've seen some great food plots planted in areas that included very poor soil. You just have to match the seed to the soil condition, meaning that you're not going to put a high-quality clover blend in sand, at least the first year, before building up the soil base. you're just opening yourself up to failure, no different than trying to plant corn in that same location. And it might be that you don't need to plant some of the lower quality or basic seeds in some high quality soil that might be more conducive to growing a high quality planting.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of taking a quick jog out from where I want to go with this, but you mentioned the fact, that you've had some success still, making food plots work in those tough soil conditions. And I know this is something that a lot of people struggle with and have questions about, especially in the northern regions. At least in my case, having some family property up in northern Michigan, we've struggled with the fact that we've got very acidic soil. So maybe really briefly, if you don't mind taking a quick step off of our main path here, how would you recommend people go about getting food plots started in an area like that with really bad soil conditions? I know you mentioned about matching the seed to the soil, but could you dive down that path just a little more?
Yeah, sure can. Now, up in the, I'm fortunate enough to live down in some really high quality soil areas down in southwest Wisconsin right now. But I really cut my teeth into the major portion of my food plotting up in the UP of Michigan, about 20 miles south of Munising. It was extremely sandy soil, very low pHs. My pHs were initially starting in the high 4s to low 5s. And, so very acidic soil. My soil tests all recommended over 4 tons per acre. Now, for example, I might have an open type area, even that had been logged and nothing had regenerated and grown for a long period of time. And so I was basically starting with ferns and a little bit of sedge and a few weeds here and there, but the soil was even such low quality that it really wasn't conducive to even high quality weeds, let alone crops. But what I found was very quickly that, especially with sand, sand reacts to lime very quickly. It's particle for particle. So if you have small, fine crushed lime, and you get that on the sand, it can change a pH quickly. And I had plots that I originally started with just an ATV and a sprayer, and or even a handheld backpack sprayer. And I would start those by spraying in July, killing the weeds, getting it down to soil that was almost exposed because of a lack of weed base. And then as long as that soil was open, it's getting the lime on there in July, August, and putting out about 150 to 200 pounds of rye per acre by the end of August, early September. And by the end of October, middle of October, I had a great green field of rye. And really, the only implements that I needed initially was a backpack sprayer and even a rake and a handheld broadcaster. And so you can do it very basic and very cheap on very poor soils, and really even lime. Now later on I graduated to a PTO mounted spreader, but I had to put on that property over 60 tons of lime in 8 years, and those were all bags, 50-pound bags. Wow. And now I did, later on I was able to empty about 30 tons, 35 tons of bags into the PTO mounted spreader, spread 1,000 pounds at a time, and that seemed like a huge luxury to me. But I did spread about 15 tons just by simply opening the bottom of the bag of powdered lime and then walking with it, spreading it about 5 feet wide as I walk by 100 feet. And if you do the math, it works out to about 2 tons per acre. And I can say you get really good at it after you spread several tons.
Yeah, I bet. Well, I'll be putting that idea to the test here pretty soon, because I'm going to be working on our northern Michigan property and putting out a lot of lime too. So we'll see how it goes.
And I think, one of the other, you have all that of getting the seed on the soil and actually trying to grow a successful crop. But really, I guess we could take a step back from there. And is this food plot going to be located in an area that hurts you or helps you? And one of the chapters that I wrote about it talks about the risks of food plots and the rewards too. And to me, the higher the level of potential reward, the higher the level of risk. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to attract a large number of deer to this location, is that a good location for you to attract a large number of deer to? And for example, having a great November food source located right behind your cabin, where you have to walk through an opening to get to all your tree stands every single morning, just might not be the best place, because you're attracting all these deer here during the evening and dark hours, and then you're starting off an hour before light and driving deer off your property before the hunt even begins. So that location is really critical, and location really if you can hide the food plot from your access, it's probably going to be in a decent spot. That's a general rule. But if you have to walk through it to get to other tree stand locations or other portions of your property, you might want to avoid that location, even if it's perfect soil and an already cleared location.
Yeah, no, that's something I've dealt with personally as well. And really, it was some of the things that you've said over the past couple of years that convinced me that I needed to make a change. I on one of the properties that I hunt, one of the only areas that looked to be open enough to put a food plot in happened to be right along one of my main travel routes deeper into this property. But at the time, I just wanted to get something in the ground. I did a little bit of weed killing and stuff I needed to open up and put the food plot in there. But then over the past couple of years, I've seen repeatedly, what I should have assumed would happen. And that's that I was busting deer out of there when I was trying to enter or exit the field or exit the property. So this year I actually decided to make the tough decision, and I'm letting it grow up. I'm not going to replant it because, like you said, there's no point to attract deer and then repel them. Like you said, it just makes things worse, actually. So. Yeah,
and and one other thing, just real quick, I get to go to dozens of clients a year across a wide range. I think I worked in 16, 17 states just the last few years, and the consistent theme that I see is I have a lot of clients tell me they put these food plots in, and our first year we had the plots was our best year. And then each year after that, we saw fewer deer during the daytime hours. Now, in some cases, I actually saw larger bucks and older bucks, but then they were in the middle of the night. And so they created this condition around these plots of high risk to the deer herd. And it wasn't just the plot area that those deer associated with a high stress level or risk level, but it has a rippling effect for 100 yards or 150 yards into the cover around that plot, depending on the size of the plot. And I believe you can take a 40-acre parcel, have a great 5-acre food plot in the middle of that 40 acres, and essentially keep the deer in the neighborhood from entering that entire 40 acres until after dark, as that condition in that central plot is just too high of a risk level that extends into the cover surrounding it too.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely something you need to think about that a lot of people aren't talking about when it comes to food plots, but it's an important thing to bring up, is that risk and how you manage that. So I'm curious, Dan, you're a guy who's not hunting property you own or property you've got sole access to. While you're hearing all this, what are your thoughts or questions you might have about food plotting from that perspective?
Well, I guess the first question that comes into my head is, because I don't own property and I probably could do some alteration to it, but it would be very minimal. And like you said, I wouldn't want to repel any deer from a situation. Is there anything that a guy like myself could do to, let's say, an ag field or to the area surrounding an ag field to potentially improve my chances, or chance of not only shooting a deer but getting or seeing more?
Really, are you talking idle ag land or ag land that's in production?
In production.
There's really, it depends on probably the relationship you have with the farmer and or the person renting the land to plant. For example, soybeans. That's a great crop to go into. Basically, people are planting. Their farmers are planting their soybeans. Let's say, typically right about now, and they have a little over 100-day maturity rate. And at the end of that 100 days, leaves start turning brown, and they're going through their life cycle. Well, at that time, in early September to mid-September, it's a great time to go in there, and you can actually hand broadcast up to 200 pounds of rye or wheat, and I'm talking winter rye or wheat, right into the standing beans, and you'll have a nice crop of green going into middle of October. That's something, of course, you'd want to check with the farmer first, but it's a very the land's already fertilized. The weeds have already been taken care of. The soil's going to be exposed and non-shaded because the leaves are turning brown. It's a great time to just simply go in there with a hand. I use a Earthway. It's a red bag spreader, and I think I've gone through 4 of those in over about a 12-year period, 10-year period. And I believe that I figured it out one time, though. Each one seems like they take about 7,000 pounds of seed and fertilizer through them before they wear out, and that's an awful lot miles on your shoulder walking with it. But simply that spreader, I believe, is $40-50, and that and some cheap rye or wheat seed, and throwing that in the standing soybeans is a great option. Another thing too is if you want to, if you have the resources to pay the farmer for an acre of corn or a half acre of corn, that could be another option to where you're locating that corn that he leaves standing for you in an advantageous spot as it relates to your access and potential stand locations within the woods. The one thing I would encourage you not to do in there is a lot of times farmers, which makes a lot of sense, it's an advantage to them if you buy those outer rows against the woods. So sometimes there might not even be a kernel of corn in those outer rows, as coons and deer scavenge and even bear in some places, a lot of those outer edges. But again, that's another option too that you can use for your planting. So those are a couple ways you wouldn't even have to really worry about any kind of tillage implements at all.
Wow, that's some really cool ideas there. I never would have thought about overseeding something like rye or wheat on the standing crop, but that I guess it makes sense. Like you said, no shade, or they're not covered up by the leaves, and you've got fertilized soil, and that's a neat idea. I might actually try that in some of my spots too. I
think I'm going to try that as well.
Yeah, that works really well. And if you notice, one of the ways they actually plant wheat in some areas is by flyover with a plane. So you drop that seed right on the exposed soil. Every year, because I go through so much winter rye. Now, winter rye is the most soil tolerant, pH tolerant, cold hardy tolerant seed variety there is. So you can really literally every year I have it grow in the back of my pickup, right within a mix of pine needles and dirt or whatever mixture there is back there, but it'll grow every year. I have a small crop of rye in the back of my pickup.
That's awesome. So taking a step back then again here, sort of looking at food plots at a high level again, a lot of people use food plots or assume they have to use food plots with just two main goals in mind, that being to hunt over or to improve available nutrition for deer. Now, in your opinion, Jeff, is that all there is to it, or can you achieve more with the use of food plots?
I think you can achieve so much more. Even the nutritional aspects, there's so much food available to deer within the growing season in the Midwest and north half of the country. Now that flips to the opposite when you travel into the south, where you have the southern drought and really harsh conditions during the summertime. They actually have better conditions in some places in the wintertime. But again, the nutrition levels are really captured primarily by the habitats that we have in the Midwest and northern half of the country, and now include ag fields. And even when you go up to the UP in Michigan, I had a personal conversation with John Azoga before, who's a noted research whitetail biologist. He's explained to me you could figure there's 5 times as much food available than the deer actually need in the northern parts, just because the deer numbers are low, and even though you don't have a lot of high quality food, there's a lot of it compared to the numbers of deer. When you get into using food to kill deer, let's look at it this way. I think in 2006, I had 18 acres of my own plots in 3 states on leased properties, and my own property, and that was Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So 18 acres of plots, over 30 food plots, and I think in the past years, I started planting food plots in '95. I've shot maybe, let's say, around a couple dozen bucks in that 3 to 7, 8-year-old range, and I've shot 2 of them on food plots themselves. So although the food plots are great for hunting, and I think they serve a significant purpose for a landowner's property, a lot of people think that you're going to sit right over these food plots and shoot a mature buck. And in my experience, I've shot a lot of bucks that were relating to our food plots, but they might have been actually 400 yards away or 200 yards away. So, and that kind of gets into that other topic of depending on when your food is complementing the cover that you have, in particular in November, I like having food because you can hold a deer herd on your property and protect that deer herd, and even advance those bucks, those younger bucks, to the next age class to a higher percentage if you have food that is available during that critical November time when really people are blasting around the woods, moving around the woods, and you have this one little honey hole of 40, 50, 60 acres that you can complement high-quality cover with food and actually hold deer. And I've always looked at it, if you're holding those deer on your property, even if you're lightly hunting the outside or just lightly hunting around that property, as long as that mature buck's there and you hunt safely, I believe what I've found is, by and large, you'll have an opportunity to harvest that buck if you don't spook them off. And so, just as, again, how much that food can help you, it can hurt you. But boy, it's so powerful if you use it to actually hold and protect those bucks and give yourself continuous hunting opportunities on that buck, basically by not letting that buck know he's being hunted. So I would think that's a real critical aspect of food plotting outside of just the nutrition and setting up a stand location to kill one.
Yes, so that's a perfect kind of transition to what my next question was, which was, how do you then set up on these properties with these food plots? I know you mentioned that you're not killing many of your deer right on the food plot, but can you tell us a little bit more about how you are positioning your stands in relation to those plots to take advantage of them?
Yeah, sure can. And one of just a consistent theme you see in this, and it makes sense if you think about it, but I'm traditionally hunting closer to the food in the evening and away from the food in the morning. And the reason for that is the most consistent, and this is something that to me is one of the base, most critical components of even habitat management and land manage for deer, and especially how I look at it with my clients. The most consistent deer movement in the woods for the entire year is daytime bedding to evening food sources in that movement. So you can count on every deer that's bedded in the woods traveling to the preferred evening food source, just like dinner time for us. And so deer are rhythmic pattern feeders. They feed 5 times in a 24-hour period. And so think of all those times they're feeding. They're standing up a couple times in the day. They want to be able to move around for mid-quality browse and feed, but they're thinking about going to that ag field or that stand of acorns or apple orchard. They really want to hit that in the evening. So when you're setting up that continual movement, then that's the most important basic use of food plotting. And so in the evening, if you're a long ways away from that food, the closer you get to dark, in theory, the less likely you should be able to see deer. On the other hand, in the morning, if I know these deer are either in that food source or around that food source in the morning hours, then I'm going to do my best to get way around those deer and a lot of times get on the backside of a bedding area with the scent blowing away from that bedding area. Or in the case of the hill country out here in Wisconsin, you can use the elevation to cheat the wind a little bit, either being above the bedding area and letting your thermals go up in the morning, or getting on a bench or a travel corridor, an inside corner of a swamp, maybe a large idle cow pasture or CRP field, where you get on that inside corner between two high-quality bedding areas to where you might have food in an entirely different direction, and you're coming into the stand location in the morning between two bedding areas in the pre-rut or rut and waiting for those bucks to cruise back and forth. And that's in my experience in here, the UP, a lot of the guys that shoot big bucks consistently and mature bucks around, they're hunting a lot of those bedding areas or those bedding area travel corridors in the morning when bucks are pretty active and low temperatures all the way up until noon, and then getting on those food sources in the evening. A lot of times, even with those, as I'm getting into that food source, I'm looking at it, how close can I get to that food source? And if you can imagine 20 deer out of that food source, or 10 or 5, can I get in and out of my stand without spooking deer on that food source? If the answer is no, then I need to back up a little bit. And one of the ways to narrow down how those deer are coming into that plot or where is if those deer are bedded dry all day, there's nothing better that you can do than add a water hole to define exactly how they travel to that food. And so out here we're adding a 110-gallon tank, burying it in the ground and keeping it half full of water and maybe a quarter full of some soil. And or we're digging out our own water hole, or some people have the luxury of getting in some equipment to make a large water hole. But that's one way to define how those deer are coming in the evening to that food source.
Yeah, that's another great tip for someone in my position or Dan's, when we don't own land, I think that's probably an easy thing that we could do to help better define that travel too. Speaking of Dan, I know you mentioned a question to me earlier you wanted to ask Jeff about related to public land hunting. Did you want to throw that one in here maybe?
Yeah, I guess it kind of all comes back to having the ability to manipulate the land that you hunt. And, obviously you can't go in, some public land, they do have food plots in there that the government puts in. But any tips or tricks for a public land hunter?
Yeah, and I think, it really depends on the state. We'll talk about two different areas. One would be natural food sources and one would be bait. And I have, guys that are out there hunting with bait, they're hunting, so that's a good thing, bottom line. So I'm not going to say anything bad about baiting, but one thing it does help you do if you're hunting on public land is the way I hunt in the UP in Michigan and the areas that I've hunted over a pretty wide area is I'm trying to identify those bait pile areas. And what I mean by that is you have quite a few two tracks coming into some high and dry hardwoods where they've recently logged, so it's pretty easy access. You have guys going to the end of those two tracks and walking in a couple hundred yards. You can't bring ATVs or machines back in the woods, and they're throwing out their blinds and throwing out their bait pile. And that's a tradition in the UP. In northern areas, it's gone on for many, many years, couple decades, I think 20 to 30 years now. And so if you can identify those bait pile areas, it's very advantageous to do that. And that's a very high risk. If you imagine guys are going in, they're putting bait out nearly every day. They're starting a week before the season, 2 weeks before the season, and the deer get used to that repetition. They get repelled, and if they do see deer, it's in those last few minutes. I've been able to shoot some really nice bucks that were going into those bait piles by coming in around the side, identifying areas that are really basically wasteland, looking for those funnels that relate to those bait piles and movements. But I've actually shot deer 1.25 miles to 1.5 miles away from those feeding areas. And I shot a buck, I think, 3 years ago back there that was a really nice Michigan buck. I think it was 4 years old. And I shot him, and later on, and he was about 1.5 miles away from an area where there's quite a few guys baiting. And come to find out, I heard of 3 guys that shared trail cam photos with me afterwards, and they were getting pictures of that buck in the middle of the night. And I believe I was back in his bedroom area that was literally 1.5 miles away. Now, one of the things you have to do with that is you have to identify even areas to start with where you can get in and be that far away from somebody and not run into someone else. So that takes finding rivers, beaver dams, marshes that you have to cross and have a pretty good knowledge of how to get into those areas and out without getting too wet, and finding those areas in between roads and the ends of two tracks where you can even find a core area that might be 1.5 miles to 2 miles wide where you can expect no people to be in. But using those bait piles as basically a high-pressure food plot, if you look at it like that, and then hunting a ways away, coming in a completely different direction than all those people would be baiting from, is a great start. And then, I've hunted out in Pennsylvania. I think I've hunted public land out in Pennsylvania 16 different seasons. And really those tops out there, we had elevation changes of about 600 feet. The bottoms had a lot of hemlock and a lot of shade, poor quality browse, and any type of mass crop. But the tops were full of oak and cherry. And so depending on if the oaks were in or the cherry or sometimes beech, then those deer, you identify those food sources up on top, which everyone else in the woods was identifying, and then you'd try to find those areas halfway down the ridges in pretty remote bench locations where you'd find those flat spots with a lot of times that were accompanied by a lot of rubs. You'd come in the opposite way of that food. You'd sit back there and wait in those low areas, sometimes 300 or 400 yards away from that food source, just knowing that a lot of deer were going to concentrate around those food sources. You're in remote areas. Guys were going to walk through there during the middle of the day, push those deer back into the recesses of the woods to where you're waiting for them. And so, that's one of those high pressure settings, but no different than your private land. You're looking to try to tie in food sources to travel corridors, bedding areas, water hole in between. The one thing on private land, you can go in there and build those conditions if you don't have them. The other thing on public land is you're looking for those same conditions. So you're doing the same thing. You're trying to protect that movement. You're trying to protect the food source, the stress level that's associated with that food source, and get in and out without spooking or destroying that line of movement on public land. So basically the same exact way you're hunting on private land, you'd hunt on public land. The only difference is you have to put on a lot of boot miles on public land to go find those same conditions.
I love the way that you're able to relate those concepts from private land back to public land. I think that's super helpful for a lot of guys out there who, if you take a look at these ideas and frameworks, there's a lot of different ways we can apply those back to our own unique situations. So that's great. Taking a step back then into specifically food plot stuff then. In your book, another topic you cover pretty extensively is, different types of things you'd recommend planting. And specifically, you talked about a concept that you called consistent diversity. And you talked a lot about why you thought that was so important. And I'd be interested in hearing, why exactly you think consistent diversity in food is important and what exactly that means.
Well, what it means, Mark, is really, I look at it like you could put a limit on any forage you might plant during the hunting season. And I'm looking at hunting season, including September too. Now, out here in Wisconsin, we start mid-September, Michigan, October 1st. Ohio, I believe, is October 1st, Pennsylvania. But you look at really trying to establish that pattern of use on your food and on your property in early September. That's when a lot of the habitat is changing, food sources are changing. Great time to capture deer, so you want that food to really start really kicking in at that time. So if you look at 4 months of the hunting season, September, October, November, December, I look at it like any forage you plant is not going to have more than a 6 to 8 week window of utilization. What I mean by that is, let's say you had soybeans all summer long. They might be outstanding in early September to early October. Then the leaves turn brown. Now, if you have high deer densities, it might still hit them, but in a lot of areas, you're not going to touch them again until late December if they're still standing. So even then, in a 4-month season, you might look at 4 to 6 weeks of great use in September, early October, another couple weeks of use in late December, and there you go, a couple months. Same with clover. Clover might peak as soon as the frost hits in October. It's going to stop growing, and every bite that's consumed is not replaced, and it might just be a mat on the ground going into December. Now, that might not be the case in Kentucky, where it can grow all season. But the point is that no matter where these forages are, they're going to have their peaks of attraction and nutrition and holding ability throughout the season. So what I like to see is, and there's two focuses of this, you want that consistent diversity within the plots, because if you want that plot to hold and attract deer the entire season, you have to have multiple offerings. So I like bases of planting. Now that base might include corn in some areas. In other areas, one of the bases might be a brassica base. Some areas in lower Michigan, they don't touch brassica. Some areas in northern Minnesota, they eat it down to the ground by October. So the key is to match the type of planting and blend that you have. For example, brassicas. In lower Michigan, you might want to add some soybeans or Austrian winter peas to it to help sweeten it if they're not going to touch it. At the same time, that's only one of your bases. I recommend that you have at least 2 bases on your food plot. The other base might be a grain base, such as winter rye or even wheat, oats. You can add winter peas to that as well. And so you have these bases of planting that basically what you're trying to do is offer forages within 2 plantings that offer attraction, nutrition, and holding ability for the entire 4 months. What else is important with that, and kind of the second part of this, is a lot of guys will go to a property and they have soybeans planted over here, wheat in this food plot, corn over here, clover in here. It's great. They're trying to hit and match all that diversity, but in theory, these deer are going to have to move from plot to plot to plot as each plot peaks in nutrition and attraction. I'd rather see that you put that same diversity within each food plot itself so that you can establish local doe family groups that relate to purely that food plot, not all 5 food plots, but just that one food plot. And what I see is you actually complement your entire property in the area you're planting, and you make your whole property more efficient per acre. You stretch the deer usage out over your entire property, and for that, You're not continually having to pound the same area hunting and spooking away the deer. So you offer a lot more options to yourself and the hunters on your property if you can spread that food out around the property and complement all of your bedding areas.
Yeah, this is another thing that I've been doing wrong over the past couple of years. But after reading your book, I'm going to be trying this out this season too. I'm going to be mixing or creating that diversity within each food plot to hopefully have that consistent movement that's all throughout the season versus one spot in October, one spot in November. So I'm excited to put that into action and see what kind of results I get.
Oh, sure.
I got a real quick question. Now, this is just a little bit off the topic, but you mentioned, the deer being able to hit a specific food plot over a certain given period of time. Have you ever, or would you recommend to one of our listeners potentially blocking off part of a food source or a food plot with like a fence, or I've seen electric fences or those or some kind of barricade to prevent the animal from getting into it and then taking it down when you're ready to hunt over it or use it?
No, I have not done that personally by myself, but I've had some clients that have relied on that, and it's been just outstanding where they've done it. And I can think of one example in particular. I've seen some of the screening materials. Now, electric fencing seems to work fairly well, real high percentage of success. But I had one northern Michigan client that actually he erected an 8-foot fence with 2 4-foot sections up, high and low all the way around a sugar beet planting, and they simply just removed the lower 4 feet of fencing, or I think he rolled it up actually, so that the deer could freely go in and out when he wanted them to at that time. Now, depending on the area you might end up, I don't even know if that would constitute baiting or not, but it was sure effective for him in his situation. I know other guys that have completely fenced off areas and they removed the fencing too within food plots within cornfields. I remember a guy in Kentucky many years ago that did that, and that could be a great advantage. It's for the guy that has a little bit more resource at hand, but it certainly is an option. I would also, if you were going to do that, really explore not only the legalities, which I think most of the time it's legal in any state, but at the same time explore the effectiveness of what people are using to block deer off. And I won't mention any certain products or anything because I would forget the names, and I wouldn't want to do that. But at the same time, there's some things out there on the market that are highly effective, and others that sound effective, and they might be for certain locations, but aren't in a very large area. So great usage at times, but really watch and look at. It's hard to argue with an 8-foot fence. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I know I've heard of people using something like that to protect small soybean food plots because, as you know, Jeff, lots of times if you got a small crop of soybeans in the summer, deer will just hammer that and you'll wipe out the food plot before you ever get into the fall. So I know some guys that have used those electric fences to protect their soybeans into the season and then let it go, and that seems to work pretty well. So interesting stuff. But we're coming up on time here pretty quick, as we always do. Time goes faster than we realize. So I wanted to throw one final question at you, Jeff. And okay. I'm curious, what do you believe is the biggest mistake hunters are making today when it comes to food plots?
I believe it's not the quality of the plot or even often the forage that they're using, the maintenance of the plot. We have such incredible information out there on how to plan a plot and make sure it's successful. I think the number one problem is location, and location as it relates to your access and how you're using it as a hunter and your ability to either hide deer on that food plot or not hide them. I think that any person that has property, they've all heard of a sanctuary where they hold and try to protect deer in that area. Some have not even walked into their sanctuaries for years. And I think we should have the same view with our food plots, meaning that each food plot is a continuation of that sanctuary. And during the hunting season, we allow those deer to freely use that food or bedding area without being disturbed by our hunting actions. And I think that would be our number one focus, that no matter how high the quality of the food plot or even the habitat, it can't overcome if a property is hunted too aggressively.
That's wise words right there. And I think something not a lot of people are talking about, but really important. So thanks for sharing that, Jeff.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, and I think with that, that's probably a great place for us to wrap things up. So anything else, though, that you'd like to add, Dan?
No, I think I got a couple tips as far as the non-landowner hunter is concerned that I might try to implement this upcoming season.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think I will too, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners as well. So that said, Jeff, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. I think we've all learned a lot, and for anyone out there who wants to get more information about you or your consulting business or your books, where can they go to get that?
They can go to whitetailhabitatsolutions.com, my website. I also have a Facebook page. They can Google Jeff Sturgis, and I think that'll get them to maybe add deer or whitetail in there, and that'll narrow it down quite a bit too. So, and I it's an honor to be on the show, and I appreciate you forwarding that information on to your listeners too, Mark.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to include that link in the show notes, and people will be able to check out those books, which I highly recommend. So that said, thank you so much, Jeff. We had an absolute blast chatting with you today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. It's nice talking to you guys.
Wow, that was excellent. And this wraps things up for us here today on the Wired to Hunt podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, if you've enjoyed the show, we would love it if you could leave a rating or review on iTunes. And for everyone that leaves a review after listening today, I will personally give each and every one of you a hypothetical virtual high five. Promise. Thanks in advance. Speaking of thanks, we'd also like to thank our excellent partners who help make this show possible. So big thanks to Sitka Gear, Bushnell Optics, Trophy Ridge, Bear Archery, Redneck Blinds, Carbon Express Arrows, Lacrosse Boots, Big & J Long Range Attractants, and the Whitetail Institute of North America. That said, be sure to visit wiredtohunt.com/episode 11 to view the show notes from today's episode, and that's where we'll include all the links that we mentioned today. And if you're new, please head over to wiredtohunt.com to sign up for our Whitetail Fix newsletter. That's where we'll send out updates on what's new and interesting on the blog. So with that all said, thanks again, Wired Hunt Nation, and until next time, have a great week, go get your hands dirty, do the work, and as always, stay wired to hunt.